Carly skipped through the house with glee as she twirled around in her Grim Reaper costume. Her mother thought this choice was morbid at first. She never imagined Carly would pick out an outfit like this. Alicia had assumed her daughter would pick a costume like a fairy, a princess, a ballerina, something age-appropriate and popular among other first-grade girls. Carly had insisted on something scary. Since the divorce, so much had changed. Alicia smiled as she grabbed her keys. Trick-or-treating lasted from 6 to 8, and she wanted to make sure they got an early start before dark. Carly looked up at her mother with inquisitive blue eyes, while Alicia explained the importance of always holding her hand and not getting separated. The energetic, blonde young girl nodded with impatient excitement. It was time to go. Children flooded the streets of the small suburb. Alicia had never seen anything like this before. They had lived in Chicago prior to this, and had never taken full advantage of neighborhood events, due to living in such a large city. And this was the first year Carly was old enough to go out trick-or-treating, in her opinion. She gripped her daughter's hand as they walked through town. There wasn't a moment in time when she didn't fear for Carly's safety. It had been a constant fear since the day she was born. Alicia noticed the sea of children running through the street. How ridiculous. Where were these kids' parents? Didn't any of them care about making sure their children were safe? It was to be expected, especially this day and age. She shook her head and kept walking. Alicia tripped over a large hole, from a chunk missing in the sidewalk. Without thinking, she fell to the ground, and caught herself with both hands. She was fine, just a small scrape on her left wrist from where she slid from the impact, but none of that mattered in those few seconds. She had let go of Carly's hand, and Carly had disappeared. Time ticked against Alicia. Her eyes searched in desperation through the press of kids walking around. Most of them had on the same Grim Reaper costume Carly was wearing. She took off running, pulling the mask off of several children, but no Carly. Alicia stopped and stood in panic. Her first response, as any mother's would be, was to scream Carly's name. But she couldn't. That would do her no good, because her daughter had never heard her voice before. Every few weeks, I find myself longing for the seclusion of solo camping. Looking forward to another night under the stars can keep me sane for a few weeks. Any longer, and I find myself itching for the sounds of the woods after the sun goes down. Today marks 6 weeks since my last trip. Shortly after I arrived home, there had been reports of a missing 23-year-old woman. A few days later, her body was found. She had been torn to shreds, and police determined that a bear had mauled her. Newspapers didn't even print pictures. I was held back from the forest that I love so much by fear, her death highlighting my own mortality. I could no longer hold myself back. With my newly purchased bottle of bear spray on my right hip, I grabbed my backpack from the bed of my truck and hiked up the highway to a concealed opening in the brush, invisible to anyone who hadn't created it. I walked the path as darkness engulfed the forest. It didn't matter. Every turn, rock, root, and stump were burned into my memory. I set up in my favorite spot, a small clearing next to a river. Perfect for stargazing, accompanied by the soothing sounds of running water. Bugs weren't bad, so my shelter consisted of a tarp and a sleeping bag. I had not brought food to avoid attracting a bear. With the shelter up and stars beginning to rise, I made a fire and lit a joint. After a few hours of enjoying the fire and stars, I retired to my shelter. A scream jolted me out of a nightmare-filled sleep, drenched in sweat. I slid out of my sleeping bag and jumped to my feet, right hand on the bear spray still at my hip. left hand fumbling for the flashlight in my pocket, listening. "Hello!" The scream came again. It sounded close, just a little upstream. Wait, no. The river was gone, as was the clearing. The woods were different from how they had been. Looking up, I saw only darkness.
"Over here!"
I yelled into the void, not wanting to leave my shelter in the unfamiliar woods. Something was very wrong. I could make out the sounds of someone stumbling through the dense bush ahead. I pointed my flashlight, hoping to make their movement easier. A blonde woman fell into my flashlight's path and looked up at me. The entirety of the right side of her face was shredded, her eyeball gone. Her cheekbone was visible through the gash running from her eyebrow to her chin. Her shredded shirt and blood-stained blue jeans told me that there were more injuries I could not see. I've been alone in the dark for weeks, she said through her mangled lips. Are you okay? I pointed the flashlight towards myself. What I believed was nightmare-induced sweat was blood. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. If you want me to tell your story, or read a creepypasta, email me at the address in the description. Be good to animals, even people. Sit.
Scout, Snemacht, Barksbus, Herish.
Accompanied by the soothing sounds of running water. Jesus.